is about journeying forward into the future.
King Charles had not given up the throne. Instead, he made a decision that shocked everyone around him. Behind the private doors of Windsor, with senior royal figures gathered, the monarch approved an emergency declaration granting Prince William a powerful new role known as Chief Regent. William showed no sign of celebration. Camilla remained silent. And when Charles slid the signed document across the table, everyone present realized the monarchy had entered completely unfamiliar ground. Before we continue, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an update. Charles kept his hand resting on the document for a moment after signing it. In this story, the emergency declaration was a formal royal order transferring key working authority without ending the king's reign. Under the new arrangement, William would supervise royal operations, coordinate household affairs, oversee major state-related duties, and manage emergency continuity measures while Charles remained sovereign. This was not an abdication. The crown still belonged to Charles, but many of the mechanisms surrounding it would now operate through his eldest son. Closing the fountain pen, the king looked toward William. "This is not the inheritance I wanted to hand over in this way," he said. William heard something beneath the firm words that troubled him even more than the statement itself: fatigue. Rather than immediately taking the document, he asked if his father was absolutely certain. "Yes," Charles replied without hesitation. Camilla observed quietly. For years, much of her influence came through her close access to the king. This declaration altered the route through which important decisions would now travel, and she understood that instantly. When William finally accepted the papers, Camilla lowered her gaze briefly before looking back at Charles, almost as though expecting him to reconsider. He didn't. William unfolded the sealed attachment clipped beneath the declaration. A confidential schedule detailing the powers attached to the role outlined which decisions he could approve without waiting for the usual household consultations. One particular clause immediately caught the attention of the senior private secretary. William noticed the reaction and read the section again, more carefully this time. Charles remained silent. Camilla shifted slightly in her chair. Then William saw the date. It had been handwritten beside the first authorization. The document had not been drafted that morning. Its preparation had been approved weeks earlier. His father had been planning this transition long before anyone else realized it. While the family believed the existing structure was still functioning, Charles had already begun preparing for something different. William slowly looked up. Camilla turned toward the king. No one spoke. The declaration revealed not only what Charles had decided, but how long he had been carrying that decision alone. To understand why the moment felt so heavy, William first had to understand what everyone in that room stood to lose. Authority was only part of the story. The real crisis sat around the family table itself. Charles remained king, yet he had placed his eldest son between himself and the machinery of the monarchy. William suddenly carried responsibility he had spent a lifetime preparing for, but never expected to receive under these circumstances. Camilla recognized another painful reality. Every new duty granted to William quietly altered her own position beside the sovereign. Charles had always believed that duty could not be divided when the crown faced pressure. Yet now he had done exactly that. The chief regent position, granting William emergency authority over critical royal operations while Charles remained monarch, forced the king to confront a difficult truth. Protecting the institution might require surrendering portions of the control he had waited decades to hold. William felt that contradiction immediately. He had spent years preparing for kingship, studying constitutional responsibilities, public engagements, and the burdens that would one day belong entirely to him. But preparation had always existed at a distance. Now decisions affecting his own father could arrive directly on his desk. And he understood something deeply unsettling. Success in this role might make Charles appear weaker. That thought troubled him far more than the power itself. Later that same day, Catherine found William standing alone with the declaration folded beside him. She watched him struggle to explain what had changed. Halfway through, he stopped. Then he admitted what he had been unwilling to say during the earlier meeting. "It feels less like a promotion and more like being handed the wheel while my father is still sitting beside me." Catherine immediately heard the concern hidden beneath the words. She asked whether he trusted Charles's judgment. "Yes," William answered without hesitation. Then she asked another question. "Do you understand why he chose to do this now?" This time, William had no answer. Meanwhile, Camilla faced her own uncertainty after the prince departed. Alone with Charles, she asked whether future decisions involving her household would now require William's approval. She expected a clear response. Instead, the king looked away and said the new structure would need time to settle. The hesitation hurt more than a refusal. Camilla pressed him again. Finally, Charles admitted that some decisions would indeed pass through his son. She fell silent. In that moment, she realized the declaration had altered not only authority, but access. Then another revelation emerged. Charles disclosed through notes from an earlier private consultation that Princess and had known about the plan before William himself. The king had sought his sister's advice because he trusted her direct and uncompromising judgment, and had supported the arrangement. But she had also issued a warning. If William received genuine authority, no one could treat him as a temporary substitute whenever his decisions became inconvenient. Later, when Charles repeated those words to his son, William immediately understood the trap. Authority without genuine freedom to act would destroy him from both directions. Soon afterward, Catherine asked the question he had been avoiding all day. What happened that convinced your father this had to happen now? The answer lay several weeks earlier. Inside what began as a routine planning meeting, Charles quietly reached the conclusion that the old system could no longer survive. The emergency declaration had not started with a dramatic announcement. It began 3 weeks earlier during a Windsor planning session that should have lasted less than an hour. Charles entered expecting an ordinary discussion about upcoming engagements, household responsibilities, and state matters. Instead, a single disagreement exposed a problem he could no longer ignore. William challenged an instruction. Camilla challenged William in front of senior staff. Charles attempted to restore order. Then a confidential briefing was placed before the king. And the atmosphere inside the room changed instantly. Charles had already appeared tired before the disagreement began. The July Windsor continuity meeting had been intended to resolve a simple question: who would approve urgent decisions if the monarch became temporarily unavailable? In practical terms, it was a planning session designed to ensure royal duties continued smoothly during any disruption. The problem seemed simple, but it was dangerous. Too many officers could offer guidance, yet no one clearly held the final word. When the discussion turned to emergency authority, William spoke first. The prince argued that he could not be expected to carry responsibility for emergency actions if he lacked clear authority over how those actions were made. For years, he had been asked to shoulder difficult assignments, reassure staff, and project stability whenever pressure increased. Yet the existing structure still allowed instructions to arrive from multiple directions. Responsibility could land on him without control. Camilla responded immediately. The Queen argued that altering the chain of command while Charles remained king could make the monarch appear sidelined within his own household. She insisted that preserving the visible authority of the crown mattered just as much as improving efficiency. William disagreed. He argued that confusion itself was already weakening that authority. Camilla's expression hardened. William refused to retreat. Finally, Charles lost patience. "Stop discussing my authority as though I'm not sitting here," he said sharply. Silence filled the room. William apologized immediately. He lowered his voice and admitted the conversation had gone too far. Camilla remained firm, convinced that the proposed changes carried a far greater risk than anyone else recognized. The king looked from one side of the table to the other. For the first time, the division he had spent months trying to manage stood openly in front of him. Then the private secretary placed a confidential continuity assessment on the table. The report documented several recent delays in urgent royal decisions because staff members were uncertain whether approval should come from Charles, Camilla's household, or William's office. Charles read the report once. Then he read it again. Removing his glasses, he placed them beside the folder. He did not blame the staff. Instead, he looked directly at William. "Then we have built a system that fails precisely when it is needed most." The king closed the folder. Moments later, he asked everyone except Princess and William to leave the room. The atmosphere changed immediately, and remained silent until the door closed. Then Charles spoke. "The monarchy cannot afford confusion at the moment it is weakest." Princess answered with her usual directness. Any new arrangement must be strong enough to prevent competing centers of influence. William understood exactly what she meant. So did Charles. And 3 weeks later, the declaration solved that problem on paper. But when William attempted to use his new authority for the very first time, the family conflict Charles feared became impossible to avoid. The first real test arrived before the ink on the declaration had fully settled. A senior royal engagement had been modified without William's approval, and under the new structure, that could no longer be dismissed as routine household business. William requested a private meeting with Camilla.
No ads. No secretaries. No intermediaries.
Just the two of them. When she entered the room, William was already waiting beside the table. Between them sat a single revised schedule. Neither pretended the disagreement was truly about a calendar. William had already reviewed the changes twice. The confidential schedule attached to his new position clearly outlined which royal decisions now required his authorization, and major alterations involving senior family coordination were among them. Camilla's office had adjusted the guest list for an upcoming Windsor reception using procedures that had previously been accepted under Charles's personal household arrangements. That process had worked because the king could settle disputes himself. The declaration existed because that approach had started to fail. Camilla sat down and pushed the revised document toward him. She explained that part of the reception plan had been discussed with Charles before the emergency order was signed. William studied the page again. Then he folded it once and placed it back on the table. "That portion stays," he said calmly. "Nothing else changes without approval." Camilla stared at him. The compromise should have reduced the tension. Instead, it made the new reality impossible to ignore. Leaning back in her chair, she reminded William that she was the king's wife, not an employee waiting for permission from his son. William answered carefully. He explained that the old process had ended the moment Charles signed the declaration. Camilla immediately accused him of stepping too quickly into authority that still belonged to his father. For the first time, William's patience cracked. "I never asked for this," he replied. "If you reject the arrangement, you are rejecting his decision, not my ambition." Camilla pushed her chair away from the table. She reminded him that Charles had spent decades waiting to become sovereign and asked whether he truly understood how dangerous it appeared for the future king to begin overruling decisions while his father still wore the crown. William understood perfectly. That was exactly why the accusation hurt. From the beginning, he had feared that carrying out the role successfully might make it look as though he was replacing the very man who had entrusted it to him. Then Camilla tested him one final time. She asked whether Charles fully realized how much authority the confidential schedule had placed in his son's hands. William said nothing. That silence changed everything. Camilla saw uncertainty where she had expected confidence. And William suddenly realized that enforcing the declaration was only the first challenge. The greater danger was discovering whether its limits existed anywhere beyond his own judgment. The confrontation proved that William intended to use the authority he had been given. But behind the new title stood a much deeper question. Who, under the declaration, actually possessed the power to stop him? The title itself sounded dramatic. The hidden clause mattered far more. Buried within the confidential schedule attached to Charles's declaration was a provision specifically designed to prevent the paralysis that had already surfaced at Windsor. For a limited emergency period, William's written instructions would take precedence in designated royal household matters unless the king personally revoked them. Senior officials immediately understood the significance. Yet the person most unsettled by the clause was not Camilla. It was William. He read the wording twice before closing the folder. The chief regent arrangement granted him executive control over selected household functions, continuity planning, senior engagement coordination, and urgent internal matters. Charles remained sovereign. The constitutional authority of the crown remained entirely his. But the distinction was important. William could direct the machinery surrounding the monarchy. He could not become the monarch through paperwork. The private secretary waited while William stared at the clause again. Finally, the prince spoke. "The wording feels dangerously close to replacing my father while he is still reigning." An aide reminded him why the arrangement had been written that way. The breakdown in July had proven the danger of shared responsibility. Competing officers had created confusion. Confusion had created delays. And Charles had decided there must be one final decision-maker. He had chosen his son. Later that day, Princess Anne arrived and immediately sensed William's discomfort. He asked whether she would accept such authority if she were in his position, and did not soften her response. "Your father was not asking whether it would be comfortable." She reminded him that refusing to use the authority out of guilt would turn Charles's sacrifice into an empty gesture. William pushed back. He insisted that loyalty still mattered, and agreed. But she warned that loyalty could become weakness if it prevented action when the institution required certainty. Then William discovered another clause. And everything changed again. Only Charles possessed the power to cancel the emergency declaration outright. Senior courtiers could advise. They could object. They could warn. But none of them could overrule William simply because they disagreed with him. The king had removed the ambiguity that had triggered the Windsor crisis. William continued reading. Soon he found the boundaries Charles had deliberately built around him. He could not alter the line of succession. He could not create or remove royal titles. He could not interfere with the sovereign's constitutional powers. The line was unmistakable. He had been given extraordinary authority, but he had not been made king. And watched his expression change. She immediately understood what he had finally realized. The danger was not unlimited power. The danger was enormous power paired with a narrow moral boundary. Closing the folder, William made his decision. The following morning he would issue his first major directive, one that would centralize senior royal coordination, redirect critical briefing channels, and force Camilla's office, his own staff, and several senior aides into a completely new structure almost overnight. By the next morning, the emergency declaration had become more than a document. It had become procedure. Briefing folders began arriving at different destinations. Senior aides received revised reporting instructions. Decisions that once traveled through multiple royal offices now reached William's desk first. Individually, none of the changes appeared dramatic. Together, they reshaped the balance of the household. For Camilla, the reality became impossible to ignore when one familiar red folder failed to appear. She reached toward the place where it was normally left and found nothing. The folder contained senior planning papers covering engagements, staffing matters, and coordination between royal officers. Assuming it had simply been delayed, she asked about it. The hesitation before the answer told her everything. The briefing had not been forgotten. Under William's first directive, it now passed through the new Emergency Coordination Office before reaching anyone else. William had centralized every cross-household decision involving senior working royals. His objective was simple. One channel. One final route. One accountable answer. Charles still received sovereign briefings connected directly to his role as king. But administrative planning that once flowed through several offices now moved through William first. The change mattered because previous delays had exposed how fragile the old system had become. Later that day, Camilla carried her concerns directly to Charles. She asked whether this outcome was truly what he had intended when he signed the declaration. The king listened without interruption. Then he answered quietly. Someone must carry final responsibility. Camilla understood the reasoning immediately. But understanding did little to ease the feeling that doors once open to her now led somewhere else before reaching their destination. Charles recognized the hurt. He tried to explain that the arrangement had never been designed to diminish her position. Its purpose was to stop competing instructions before they weakened the household again. Camilla replied that intention and consequence were rarely the same thing. The king did not argue. Across the palace, courtiers adapted quickly. Senior officials began bringing disputed matters to William before approaching other members of the family. They were not choosing sides. They were following the authority outlined in the emergency order. William noticed the shift as well. And with every new request, the weight of his position became harder to ignore. Then one official tested the boundary. Privately, he asked Charles whether a disputed directive issued by William should be softened before implementation. The king offered no protection. "Follow the instruction," Charles replied. That brief response settled more than one disagreement. It confirmed the transfer of authority was real. William learned about the exchange before the day ended. Rather than feeling empowered, he felt the burden grow heavier. That evening, he went to see his father alone.
No folders. No secretaries.
No official briefing. The machinery of the monarchy had accepted William's authority. But only one conversation could determine whether the father and son within that machinery could survive what the crown had demanded of them. There were no advisors in the room that evening.
No confidential schedules.
No private secretaries. No queen. No Princess of Wales. Charles had asked William to come alone. For days, the prince had treated the declaration as a responsibility to understand and a burden to carry. Now he wanted something more personal. He wanted the truth. Why had his father chosen this moment? Why grant such sweeping authority? William left every official document outside before entering the king's private sitting room. That decision mattered. Both men wanted a conversation untouched by palace procedure. The sitting room was one of the few places where the machinery of monarchy could be left at the door. William took his seat opposite his father. Then he asked the question directly. Had the declaration been triggered by a single emergency? Or had Charles begun to believe he could no longer manage every part of the monarchy alone? The king did not defend himself. Instead, he admitted something he had never publicly acknowledged. The breakdown during the Windsor meeting had frightened him more than he had allowed anyone to see. Decisions had stalled because everyone waited for his personal intervention. Staff hesitated. Officers competed. William carried responsibility without clear authority. But what troubled Charles most was not the disagreement itself. It was how quickly the entire structure slowed whenever everything depended on one person. Then the king finally said what William had feared hearing. He had not created the chief regent role because he wished to surrender responsibility. He had created it because refusing to share responsibility had started to endanger the very institution he hoped to preserve. The title had been deliberately strong. Charles wanted every royal household, every senior official, and every courtier to understand that William's authority could not be treated as optional whenever it became inconvenient. William absorbed the confession quietly. Then he leaned forward. "I can carry this with you," he said, "but I cannot carry it instead of you." For the first time that evening, Charles smiled faintly. He reached across the space between them and assured his son that he had never intended that outcome. The declaration had been created to place strength beside the crown, not to erase the man wearing it. William agreed to continue. But he placed one condition on the arrangement. If Charles disagreed with any decision, he must say so directly. No messages through courtiers. No instructions passed through relatives. No attempts to reverse decisions from another room. The king accepted immediately. That promise changed something between them. For the first time since the emergency began, authority no longer felt like a wall. It felt like trust. By the following morning, however, their private understanding would face a challenge neither of them could control. The declaration was about to move beyond palace walls. Father and son were finally aligned. The household could contain its internal tensions, but it could not control what would happen once two words reached the outside world. Chief Regent. By sunrise, the private declaration had become public knowledge. Two words dominated television screens, newspaper headlines, radio broadcasts, and mobile phones across Britain. Chief Regent. Some people interpreted it as abdication. Others viewed it as an emergency measure. Outside Buckingham Palace, cameras gathered long before officials had finished explaining what the title actually meant. Yet one image captured the national mood better than any headline. A small crowd stood silently at the palace gates, reading the official notice again and again, as though a second reading might somehow make the announcement less extraordinary. Buckingham Palace soon confirmed the central fact. Charles remained king. William would exercise emergency operational authority under the newly created chief regent arrangement. The distinction mattered. William could direct designated royal functions. He could not become sovereign through the declaration. An abdication would have required Charles to surrender the crown. This arrangement did nothing of the sort. Instead, it created an additional layer of authority within an existing reign. For several tense hours, the public struggled to understand where one role ended and the other began. Catherine watched the confusion reach her husband before he faced the cameras. The Princess of Wales found William alone, rereading the palace statement. She warned him that every pause, every word, and every expression would be examined for clues about what had happened behind closed doors. William understood immediately. Even silence now carried meaning. One careless sentence could transform a transfer of responsibility into speculation about a collapsing reign. Camilla faced pressure from another direction. She continued with a scheduled engagement and maintained her composure in public. Later, however, she privately wondered whether William's elevation would be viewed as evidence that she had been pushed away from the center of royal influence. Charles assured her that the declaration concerned continuity, not humiliation. She accepted the answer without argument. Yet the question itself revealed how deeply the change had reached. Then the public found its symbol. A fictional newspaper, the Chronicle, appeared with a giant headline stretching across its front page. William takes the reins. Crowds gathered behind the barriers outside Buckingham Palace. When William's motorcade entered the gates, scattered applause began to spread through the crowd. It was not exactly celebration. It was recognition. People understood that something historic had happened. William stepped toward the microphones carrying prepared remarks. He paused, folded the notes once, then abandoned his opening script. "My father remains your king." The statement immediately changed the atmosphere. William continued by explaining that his duty was to support Charles, preserve continuity, and carry the responsibilities entrusted to him, not imitate a reign that had never ended. Those words calmed much of the public anxiety. The question was no longer whether William had replaced Charles. The real question became what the declaration revealed about both men. Charles had not ended his reign. He had redefined what strength within that reign looked like. In the end, the most important part of the declaration was not the unprecedented title. It was the decision behind it. A king who had spent a lifetime preparing to wear the crown had chosen, while still wearing it, to share the burden before that burden threatened the institution itself. William accepted the responsibility without triumph. Camilla absorbed a painful reduction in influence. And the monarchy emerged changed, not because a reign had ended, but because responsibility had moved before necessity forced it. Charles remained sovereign. That never changed. The chief regent arrangement granted William defined emergency operational authority, while his father continued to reign as king. The Prince of Wales had not become monarch early. Instead, he became the final authority for selected royal operations, ending the confusion that had exposed weaknesses within the royal household. Charles eventually stopped viewing delegation as defeat. What he once feared would diminish him ultimately strengthened the institution he served. William understood the lesson as well. His challenge was not simply exercising power. It was exercising it while honoring the father whose reign continued. Camilla gradually accepted the structure after Charles made one point unmistakably clear. This had been his decision. Disagreeing with William was one thing. Fighting the arrangement itself meant challenging the king's own judgment. That realization prevented temporary tension from becoming a permanent family fracture. When the emergency structure finally settled, William returned the original signed declaration to Charles. Placing it before him, he said quietly, "This belongs with the sovereign who signed it." Charles accepted the original document. Then he pushed the confidential working copy back toward his son. "That one stays with you," he said. "The responsibility is on your desk now." As the meeting ended, Charles rose and offered his hand formally. William looked at it for a moment, then ignored protocol completely. Instead, he embraced his father.
No titles. No ceremonies.
No arguments about authority. Only a father who had learned to share the burden and a son who had learned that accepting it did not mean replacing him. The crown remained with Charles. The future remained with William. And the emergency declaration finally joined those two realities together, transforming what looked like royal weakness into a deliberate act of trust, duty, and responsibility between a father and the son who would one day follow him. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next video.